Andy Schumann's going to be moderating our panel on ethics, and I'll let Candace take us over to that spotlight there. Thanks all, and thank you, Andy, for getting us started.
Truly my pleasure. I'll just give it a second for folks to get highlighted here. You can hear me okay, I assume?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Loud and clear, man.
Perfect. Well, maybe I'll start with introductions as we are getting our panelists up on the screen. First off, thank you to you, Alex. You've been a friend and a colleague for many years, and it's really gratifying to see you take a leadership role in really advancing a multidisciplinary question that, of course, doesn't have an easy answer, which is why we're going to spend a day talking about it, but is so incredibly timely and important for us from so many different angles as well, whether it be quality improvement, ethics, education, law, and so on. We're going to spend the next half hour to 45 minutes talking through some of the ethical dilemmas, and we've been set up beautifully by the introduction as well as by the questions that were posed to put us in position to address these. First, let me take the privilege of inviting and introducing an amazing panel. Dr. Angie Wall is also a friend and colleague of mine who I've worked with for many, many years now. And she is a abdominal transplant surgeon at Baylor Scott and White in Dallas. She is trained as a philosopher, as well as an ethicist, as well as a transplant surgeon by St. Louis University, as well as Vanderbilt and Stanford. Her research is really pushing the envelope of the clinical ethical issues in surgical practice related to transplantation, specifically related to organ allocation. And she has a background in international medicine and actually wrote a textbook, really the seminal textbook on international surgical ethics as a trainee many years ago. Welcome, Dr. Wall. Also, Dr. Ganai is a surgical oncologist with expertise in hepatobiliary and foregut tumors, among others. Her area of interest is in rural health disparities, and she has done some truly remarkable work in this field through Stanford at her home institution, as well as on the national level. Welcome as well. And finally, Dr. Davino is an internationally renowned surgical educator and leader from New York. She's the chief of the Division of General Surgery and the Edelman Professor of Surgery with a background in teaching, both tried and true as well as novel methodologies. So everything from how to take a junior resident through a case through how to run an innovative surgical stimulation center involving the very types of technologies we're talking about today. And as her day job, she is a laparoscopic gastrointestinal surgeon with a focus on carcinoid tumors, and also has national leadership in the surgical education realm. I did not do any of you enough of a service, but I only have 30 to 45 minutes, so I wanted to leave time to hear from you. With that, I'm going to start with a general question that I'll pose broadly to the group. What are the broad ethical issues that you see us facing when it comes to the issue at hand with regard to surgical recording? And Dr. Wall, perhaps you can start us off.
All right. Well, first off, thank you so much for this, for the lovely introduction. Andy and Alex, thank you for the invitation to be one of the panelists here. So the introductory group really talked about several of the ethical issues that I see with surgical recording. If you break it down into what I think everybody thinks about when they go through an ethical analysis, it's the risk, benefit, harm analysis first. And the way that I think about the risks, I think about each stakeholder group. What are the risks to patients? What are the risks to physicians? And what are the risks to the other operating room team? What are the benefits to each of those groups? From a patient standpoint, one of the biggest risks that I see and that we've talked about is the loss of privacy, the potential loss of privacy. From a professional standpoint, there are the medical legal concerns, as well as security of the videos. And then the other thing is sort of this concern that somebody is going to look at the videos and judge, me as a professional, or how I operate, or tell me to operate differently because of the surgical videos. The benefits are myriad. There's the safety benefit for patients. There is education, the education benefit for trainees. There is quality improvement benefits for surgeons. If I watch a video of one of the surgeries that I do, I can go through it and say, these are the places where I was struggling. This is how I could have done it differently. This is how I could have changed my visualization. And then the next time I do the surgery, that's what I focus on. So there's a ton of benefit to the surgical videos. The other benefit that that we have to bring out there as academics is the professional benefit of publication. The American College of Surgeons has a video library. There's an opportunity for presentations of video abstracts at many different professional conferences. So there is a professional development component to the benefit of surgical recording. The other ethical issues that come up are autonomy. Who should be involved in the consent for recording? How do you have that conversation with the patient? With how is the surgeon's autonomy important? What if the surgeon doesn't want to record? And how about the OR staff? So there are multiple different stakeholders that need to be considered in the process of who should consent or at least assent to recording. And then does the consent process or the discussion have to address what the recording is used for? Are there different ways that this particular video is intended to be shared? Is it a PR thing? Is it in an education video? Is it a quality improvement video or a research video? And so does what level of detail has to go into the consent? And then finally, and we'll probably talk about this a little bit later, are the questions of justice. Are certain groups going to benefit more or have higher burdens from surgical recording? So I'll leave my kind of 2 cents there and see what our other panelists have to say.
Fantastic. Dr. Kanai?
So just to add to that, and I think Dr. Wall did a wonderful exploration of the primary balances in terms of risks and benefits. But I think it's also important to add in terms of the primary duties, in terms of the surgeon-patient relationship, and areas where they can be conflicts of commitment with those duties. And really, when we're exploring the distinguishing a surgeon-patient relationship with the traditional doctor-patient relationship, there's that one fiduciary duty and obligation to the patient that's the primary role of in terms of where informed consent is derived and that whole process. However, the surgeon also has duties and obligations to their trainees in terms of the things that were described of exploring how surgeons may assist other surgeons. There may be surgeon-to-surgeon duties that could be explored. And then finally, the relationships with surgeons and their teams are also areas where there can sometimes be conflict. And one of the key things in terms of the addition of both audio and video recording to the team dynamic is it actually not just records action, but it records behavior and interactions between team members. And the whole thing in terms of what truly is context of what is being done in an OR can sometimes be misconstrued by people who don't actually have that perspective without explanation in that sense. And certainly when we're talking about audiovisual recordings, we also taking in the perspective of the recording itself. We have multiple ways of looking. If I'm doing a robotic case that's being recorded, you could actually record the patient, as a whole with the room. You may be able to record the actual video feed from the console, from the telescope. But you may not actually have the perspective of what is happening at the anesthesia side of things, and the reality is this may be variable in terms of how this is translated from OR to OR in terms of what the capacity is and what you are actually recording. So it's a complex system that we're talking about, and when we're talking about a complex system, there are actually competing duties that we have in terms of that. And to even make it even more complicated from a legal context, a surgeon may not be employed by the hospital they're working in. They may really be respecting medical bylaws in terms of their actions, but the employed parties might actually be the team members, and those team members may be coming and going in the OR.
Fantastic. And of course, over the next half hour or so, we're going to explore that in much more depth. Dr. DeVito?
I think Dr. Ganai and Dr. Wall really covered a lot of aspects of this. My, real interest in this, the only thing that I would like to touch on are two things. One is really education and quality and its role in this. From the educational standpoint, one of the biggest challenges really lies in the first step in getting the consent. And every institution has their own version of what their consent is. Our institution seems to have a blanket statement for everything. And there's a line number 4, I think, that says something about video recording. I would say 40% of patients see that line. Everybody else doesn't see that line. And that 40%, sometimes maybe half of those will cross that line out because of probably misunderstanding of what they think people are going to do with the video recording. Just for transparency, our institution is about to collaborate with surgical safety with Theodore. And boy, is that an eye-opening experience to start something like that from many perspectives. Looking at it from an educational perspective, how do you educate the person getting the consent, who's usually the least common denominator? It's the intern getting a consent for some complex procedure. They probably don't even know all the time what the risks and benefits, and that falls on us. I always say it falls on me as the program director to try to find a way that shouldn't happen. But you and I know that that's what happens. And how do you express that with the patients and have the buy-in in this landscape where more and more patients are questioning the role of the residents and the educators pushing more and more the value of autonomy? It's really a very, very big challenge. And the second thing in terms of quality is really, I agree with Dr. Ganai that the communication, the flow, perhaps in the operating room, I don't know how that's going to happen because I still have to witness it, may be altered in some way because they know that they are being taped. It's almost, I don't know, perhaps it's a Hawthorne effect, but it exists and has been reported and bears to be seen. The third issue is the ownership of the videotape. Where does that go? I mean, we talk about destroying it or retention. We like to talk about retention because, as it said in one of the papers that we're reading, it has a more positive spin to it. But the fact is that how long do we keep it? And we talk about having video libraries, but that is not an unlimited resource, an unlimited time. And I guess the last bit is the legal aspects of it. We are protected because it could be very well part of the peer review process. By definition, the peer review process protects it from discovery. But then again, there will be instances where harm has been done to the patient, and that can be used in terms of a defense or the prosecution of a case. But having said that, I agree so far with Dr. Freed, Dr. Grant-Shirov, Dr. Ganai, and Dr. Wall that the values, by far, of course, I'm a little bit biased, the benefits will prove to outweigh the risks and all the barriers that we have.
Fantastic. So I'd like to delve into one specific issue that came up in your comments, Dr. DeVito, which is whether we consider these recordings quality improvement, routine clinical care, research, or some amalgam thereof. And the reason this is important, as you intuitively know, is the way each of those categories is regulated is completely different. So the consent process for routine clinical care versus quality improvement versus research versus education all look different and are all regulated differently. Now, of course, law and ethics are related but not synonymous. And we all know intuitively that consent and relationships with patients are not necessarily driven by what we're legally obligated to do, but by what we should do. But it is a truism to state that we still need to follow the rules and the regs, and we should be aware of them. So with that said, how do we reconcile issues of consent vis-a-vis how we conceptualize surgical recordings when they're in reality being used for multiple different endpoints? And my guess is each of you are going to have thoughts on this. So I'll just open it up for an open discussion rather than pick on folks, so to speak.
Well, I'm happy to kind of take the first stab at it. So a lot of this, I think maybe the most clear category that we could start with is the idea of research. So if we start with talking about research, when the intention of the recording is to either publish results or to gain generalizable knowledge or to do some sort of prospective review of patient outcomes or of some piece of the process with the intent of publication, either in an abstract form presentation or a manuscript, then I think you're looking at research. And when that is your intent, then that is where the IRB needs to be part of the process, and there will likely be a secondary consent form that goes specifically to the research part of the study. When you draw the line down to quality improvement, that can be part of that is typically part of your routine care or your regular surgical consent, your regular surgical discussion. So I think that really drawing the line between research versus clinical care quality improvement is where we have to figure out where that line is. There's a lot of literature about surgical innovation and where you have an innovation versus a research study. And I think we can draw from that literature to sort of develop the same line for surgical recording.
And to add to that, I think kind of understanding how there can sometimes be uncertainty in terms of the data that is collected. I think we can extrapolate from what is learned from genetics and genomics from a research context that you can exclude providing information back to the patient if it's not necessarily going to change their care. That I think is a little bit of a gray area. And I think that one of the uncertainties that I see is moving forward, if the patient's able to get the recording back, if they own that recording, are there going to be unforeseen, unintended consequences from that? Partly because even if they are included in, obviously, in terms of the consent process and discussion of what is going on, that video then can go to families and other people through the process of sharing. And I'm just a little unclear in terms of the if there are benefits of returning the data to the patient.
Let me play devil's advocate. One of the challenges is when you identify a QI or a performance improvement project, you have a hypothesis. For every academician, that you have something in the back of your head. You want a twofer. If something comes out of this, you're going to publish. Oftentimes, there are many, many initiatives that start off as a QI and don't need an IRB if you say this is part of the Performance Improvement Committee. And if something comes out of it and you do wish to do an abstract and do a paper or expand or a grant, then people proceed to do an IRB. So that's sort of a fine line there that I am guilty of and I struggle with. And having been chair of quality, I had to, sort of referee that which I think really is truly a QI and which I know is really is on its way to being an abstract at the next, meeting. I think there's a very appropriate comment on the chat room that says that the irony of QI is that you have to promise not to learn anything generalizable. And it is quite true. So I'm not so sure, and I don't know what people's thoughts are about how you can do something comprehensive that's transparent. Our institution hasn't quite really successfully navigated through that, but perhaps other people have, because it's a natural progression that I see all the time that happens with projects. And this could be one of those.
So I think we're getting into the meat of this, and for the explicit legal question of regulatory components of this, we have a fantastic panel next that I'm sure will opine in more depth. But I think from an ethical standpoint, it is important, at least specifically for how we think about it with regard to the consent process. So let's focus a little bit more on the patients and the consent and how we frame that for them. Because the garden variety patient facing a cancer operation or a transplant is not necessarily thinking about whether their data are going to be generalizable. They're worried about privacy. They're worried about whether or not they're going to make it off the table, much more so than anything else. So how do we frame this in a way that makes this palatable to individual patients? And again, I don't know about your setup, but in general, this is discussed with our patients in pre-op, when they haven't eaten, when they're wearing a paper-thin gown, when everyone's wearing masks, where their families aren't allowed back, and where they're absolutely terrified about what they're facing. And oh, by the way, we're going to be taking recordings of what we do in there. For many patients, that's going to either be glossed over, or that is going to just augment their terror and their discomfort. So how do we do this in a way that is appropriate, recognizes the massive power dynamic that our patients are experiencing, but also satisfies both the ethics as well as the regulatory side of what we're doing? Now, if we can answer that in the next few minutes, I'll be very impressed. Please. Maybe we'll start with Dr. Ganai.
Yeah, I think one of the issues that also begs this question is the concept of consenting for teaching in the operating room. And that is not often discussed explicitly. Sometimes it's implied that we are at an academic institution. We work with surgical residents. You've already perhaps met some of our surgical residents, and this is a process. And certainly, most of us as surgeons have our own ways of scripts of responding to patient inquiries about addressing, having teaching in the operating room. This is something that we're quite familiar with, but at the same time, is it an explicit piece of informed consent, that process of teaching? It often is a byline in terms of discussion that there is a team working with you in the written portion, but really when we're coming down to what informed consent is it's a process that the patient has some understanding and comprehension of the indications, risks, benefits, and alternatives of the procedure, and that that probably should include, what some discussion in terms of the process of teaching and the process of recording. I think one of the key issues here from a pragmatic standpoint is time. And how does a surgeon who has a busy practice, first of all, discuss the actual clinical issues involved with the patient's care, but two, then the practical aspects of working in an OR with a team that there may be multiple people working with them. And so I think we need to greater explore other additions to the informed consent process, including educational materials, videos, those kinds of things that could help describe or support, the actual process of what happens in an operating room and what the data actually means and how it would be used.
I know we have very limited time, and I will say, just add a little bit to what Dr. Ganai said, because she said it very clearly. One is that I think I want to look at it from an educator's hat. And I think we don't put as much emphasis on consent, and it really should be a competency. And we don't stress that enough. Ultimately, it's the attending who is responsible and should really be getting the consent. But in the real world, is that realistic? It's not realistic, and probably not good when you're training residents and from the educational perspective. But I think if we do establish some guidelines so that it should really be considered a very important competency. After all, that encompasses 2-3 core competency already there that's required. I think it will go a long way.
And I think that'll be a really wonderful thing for us to talk about in the working groups this afternoon in terms of how we can have real deliverables in terms of moving forward, whether it's from a research standpoint or a process and flow standpoint. I do want to transition slightly. Oh, Dr. Wall, I saw you unmuted. Would you like to say something on this topic?
I just wanted to add, so we actually do a lot of recording for our transplants through PR. So not for research, but we have a really good process for that. So the patients who we ask about recording, we ask them in clinic. So it's not when they come in. We ask way ahead of time. We go through the consent with the patients. We also we have a consent form for everybody who's in the operating room, and we let everybody know in advance that this is going to happen, that there will be cameras, and that everybody has consented and everybody is aware that this is going to happen. And so I do think that speaking to patients in the clinic setting when they have their family around and they're not under that same sort of pressure, duress, et cetera, is a great way. If you know ahead of time that you're going to be doing this, or this is part of what you're doing in these particular operations, you can have that conversation earlier in a more controlled setting.
Great. The privacy issue is an obvious one that we've touched on, but let's explicitly talk about it. And I'll share what I find to be an amusing anecdote related to this. So at a facility where I work, there are some very strict rules about any type of photography or videography in an operating room. Again, I'll be transparent. This is a veterans hospital where there's very, very strict rules on how this plays out. And there's a dedicated camera and video equipment that you're allowed to use that is vetted and controlled. One of my colleagues took a picture before and after of a complicated eyelid reconstruction after a cancer operation and the reconstruction thereafter. Again, playing by the rules, taking pictures with the government camera. And when those pictures were returned, in order to preserve confidentiality, the eyes were blacked out. So again, obviously, this is not best practice, and well-meaning people obviously were doing their best and did not achieve the endpoint here. So how do we honor dignitary needs and recognize confidentiality, especially in an era in which everything that goes up on the web is potentially discoverable or there forever, while still achieving the endpoints that we've all just talked about? So what should the rules be? In how do we draw them in a way that they're transparent and clear, but also malleable so that, for example, when you're operating on the eyelid, you can see it in the picture. Dr. Davino, I know you've done a lot of work on the education side of this, and obviously identifiable images are used routinely in the educational component of recordings. Perhaps you can speak a bit to this in terms of your role with social media, with your trainees, as well as with educational recordings.
Well, that's a broad swath there you're covering. I think let's do it one piece at a time. In terms of presenting cases, all pertinent information, obviously very, very obvious, medical record number, identifiers cannot be included in any presentations, and any photographs that will in any way identify a case to a patient is not allowed. I'm not so sure how you could do it with the eyelid, but there are different parts of a person that you may be able to conceal to do that. In terms of social media, we actually are sort of ruled or whatever, guided by the social media guidelines of our institution. No patient-related information must, can go on social media, whether it is for any kind of humanistic purpose or, non-leisure activity. No patient-related information can go on social media. I'm not sure if that's too harsh, but we have to abide by that. That's our institutional law. In terms of privacy, I think this is a very, very constant problem that we have with medical students and residents, and they are able to always come up with more creative ways of sharing patient information, whether it is, I'm not sure. I mean, they really are quite creative. I don't want to go into it, but somehow it comes out there, whether it was a trauma case that you would never be able to identify, but they seem to do that. I think it is very important that those things should be established. It may be a very harsh rule, but it seems to work for us.
Yeah, I think it primarily comes back to patient autonomy and respect for persons. And, when we look at global medical missions, there was a period of time where people were posting Facebook posts of their patient encounters and such, but there's an element of trophyism there. A picture of a very large goiter, a picture of a very large tumor. And does that respect the patient? Is that picture actually for an educational purpose, or is it actually kind of exploiting that patient in a way? And I think we need to be clear in terms of our professional duties to the patients we care for, even from a global context, when people do mission work. I think that this correlates in terms of how we use videos. Is there an educational intention of that video? Are we teaching? And is there something identifiable of the patient within that recording?
Great. Let's transition a little bit to how patients and the public may utilize these recordings. So what control do they have? So when a patient says, can you send me the picture of my tumor? Or the patient says, well, if you recorded my operation, I'd love to see part of that. What are the guidelines? And again, focusing more on the ethics here rather than necessarily the rules, although if you have institutional guidelines on this, that would be great to hear as well. So the corollary here is, are we making these purely for us, or do patients have the right and the ability to request either parts or all of these and to utilize them how they see fit? So should we be posting or allowing patients to post the sausage being made, so to speak, on their own social media accounts or share with their friends or family?
So I'll start with this one. One of the things that has recently occurred in Texas, where I am, is that we automatically release the medical record data to our patients. So we use the Epic system. We have to, by Texas law now, automatically give them access to their entire medical record. So when I write an operative report, my patient has access to that operative report immediately. And one of the things we've found is that this is actually becoming a really big problem, because they'll read the operative report and then start picking little pieces out and then start asking all these questions like, well, was this outside of the norm? Was this, what did you do with this? And it's taken totally out of context or totally out of an understanding of what occurred in the operating room. Like sometimes in my transplant, liver transplants, I write, because there was no qualified resident available, I required the assistance of a second attending surgeon. Those sorts of things, when that's needed for the billing part, but it also like raises red flags in a weird way for our patients. So one of my concerns with extending into access to operative recording is when patients have access to these videos, taking this out of context and not really understanding what is happening in the operating room, and then questioning what is happening in the operating room. So I'd like to hear others' thoughts on that piece.
I think this is a real challenge. From a legal standpoint, it is part of their medical record and they should be able to have access. Now, from your standpoint, do you give them an edited version, the one you submit to SAGES that looks beautiful with no bleeding and takes 2 minutes, or the long version? I don't know. I think that's probably institutional. From our institutional bylaws, every patient is entitled to their record, and record is record. That includes videos. Now, who holds the videos? It is in either one, the cloud, or two in your thumb drive, or you can put it on the electronic health record. Now, EMR is a very, very big conundrum now and challenge, because patients can access their charts. They can read everything. So by definition, that's part of their record, and they should be able to do that. But again, I think it is important to establish bylaws if videos are a big part of your practice or your record, that you can say, yes, it is your video, but we will give you a copy of it. It's not just whatever the edited version. And as Dr. Wall said, people tend not to understand what exactly is going on in the actual case. So just to summarize, our institution policy is they have rights to all the records, and all the records includes recordings. The extent of the recording at the moment is established as what the surgeon chooses to provide to the patient.
Great. And this obviously has been a conversation that's going to continue throughout the legal session as well as the breakouts later. We only have a few minutes left, and one thing that we've neglected, which is a clear ethical imperative, is what Dr. Wall brought up at the very beginning related to equity and justice. So what are the threats to equity and justice here? And how may some groups or individuals who are either more vulnerable or in certain settings have higher levels of risk or burden related to what we're talking about, in a way that we need to mitigate or at least recognize as surgical recordings become more commonplace?
From our standpoint, the biggest challenge in implementing recording the entire operation has been not as much from the patient, but from everybody else in the operating room. We had to navigate how to ensure that everybody in the room understands that this is not to be used for the demotion, promotion, remediation, firing, or anything, because it becomes for disciplinary action, because that becomes a very tricky situation. Negotiating with the unions is a very, very big challenge. And that was something that I learned the very, very, very hard way, that is a key part of it. Patients also, on the other hand, have to understand that this is not limited to patients that they think are part of a research protocol or an experiment or something. And sometimes it is inevitable that certain patients will feel that they are being part of a group of patients that are being studied on. And it is automatic, when you have a two-tiered process of a private office and a resident clinic, where only those in the resident clinic should be taped or should have certain procedures. So I think we have to be very cognizant and be very careful of that this is a universal practice, not something limited to certain population groups.
Dr. Ganai, thoughts on this?
Yeah, I agree. I think that the whole issue of conceptualizing areas where people can feel vulnerable, and that includes our staff members who may actually kind of feel like they have to comply even if they don't feel up to it. But certainly in terms of doing this as an approach to all patients, I think that that's a critical feature in terms of not the equity aspect of certain patient populations feeling that they are being used in some way.
And of course, part of this, just given the national movement, is recognizing that people feel that way for a very good reason. And that's because we as a medical establishment have subjugated individuals' rights, and we have not taken people seriously, and we have disproportionately treated people of difference, whether that's related to race, ethnicity, color, or anything else, unfairly. So again, the need of our group is to be transparent, obviously, about that history and to recognize that trust is earned and that we need to do a better job of earning it. Hopefully, the types of interventions we're talking about today, both to improve quality, to improve education, and also to better educate and prepare people for what we're doing and why, will be a step towards that direction. But I do think we need to recognize that history in order to be able to move forward. We only have a few minutes left before we're transitioning to the next session. If anyone has other thoughts or summation that they'd like to share, I'm going to open that here. And I see Dr. Langerman just put his screen on, so he can take moderator's privilege to ask a final question if he'd like as well.
Dr. Clayton did point out that the sharing of medical records is federal law, not just Texas law. So just to be clear for the group.
That's fantastic. Yeah, actually, I'm so amazed that this panel was fantastic. I thought I knew a lot I'm a surgical ethicist. I thought I knew a lot about the ethics of surgical recording, and so many new ideas came out of this panel. I am incredibly grateful to the three speakers, and of course to Dr. Schumann and Andy for the fantastic moderating. I was mostly getting on to kind of transition the way to the next panel, but if there, one thing I just want to let the audience know is if you have questions, thank you for those of you who've been posting questions. Many of them have come through the chat. Please post them in the Q&A, because that will actually get visible to the entire audience. It can be upvoted. That's the best way to post questions here. And we'll make sure that we get answered. And thanks for addressing some of those, which I think were all addressed in this panel session. Andy, do you have any last remarks? We got a couple minutes left, or?
Thank you so much. Honestly, it's a privilege to speak with this group. My job for the past 45 minutes is to be as quiet as possible so we can learn from this wonderful panel. So thank you all.
Great.
Thank you, Andy.
Looks like we do have one question, which I'll read out loud, but to acknowledge it, and then I think we'll start to get in the legal panel in just a minute here. So, first, the question was whether material would not automatically be protected under peer review. And that is a question. And I think that is a true statement, that it's unclear whether surgical recording would be automatically protected, but we'll let the legal panel get into some more details about that. And then let's see, another question about the patient awareness of the EMR interface. We talked a little bit about that as well, but the idea of open notes and how that has caused some changes in the way that we prepare patients for what to expect has been a really interesting change. And I think There we go. So coming up next is going to be thank you all for your panel participation. I'm really grateful you're part of this. You've made a tremendous contribution. And so thank you again for being here.